An associate professor and the head of the Department of Sociology at the Faculty of Social Studies at Masaryk University in Brno. He teaches a number of courses for undergraduate and doctoral students, and he specialized in sociological theory and cultural sociology. His research focused on the processes connected with social construction of identities, and his habilitation thesis, and I think it was the name of the book as well, was Transnational Migration, Identities, Boundaries, and Interpretation in Motion. He's an author of a number of articles and books focused on transnational migration, critique of methodological nationalism, conceptualizing race and racism. And his today's presentation is on cultural contradictions of transnationalism. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My task is somehow dangerous because in the last years, because of my ethnical and cultural background, I'm worried what's happening in the South and in Central Europe, and therefore I'm trying to understand, not to explain, but to understand exactly what we know on the labels of populism, nationalism, racism, and all that stuff. And as you know, there are some of my friends who claim that if you go too close to the devil, then you will smell also. It means that please do not read or listen to me. I didn't make any kind of conservative turn or something like that. But really, I think that it's for me personally also it's a kind of challenge to understand how is it possible that, for instance, like the government of Viktor Orban won the third time, two-third majority in the parliament in Hungary. And I think that it's a very important question, and because it's similarly as we make a research somewhere and then claim that, okay, we discovered something because it's somehow, it reveals something, that I think that they are somehow producing a big experiment for us to show something, but we have to find out how to read it, how to understand what is happening around that. And similarly, as Marek in the beginning said, that we can treat it as just a kind of deviation in the south, right? But we can see a lot of other cases from Serbia to Poland, and other events which show that actually the world as we know it is eroded, and we need somehow look out from our academic tours and try to understand how so-called ordinary people are also having their worldviews. So let me start with widely from trying to show you or setting my theoretical frame, and starting with a concept or a word which is very widely used, also to understand actually we know that it's almost an empty signifier, freedom, right? In the same time it has a symbolic power, and this symbolic power is used not only in politics but also in business, everywhere. And as we know from Michel Foucault, freedom is dangerous. And that's important because freedom is also about freeing, and mainly about freeing ourselves. It means that if we want to understand what is behind several kind of political and not just political forms of direct action, like trying to cross the Mediterranean, it's a kind of, we can use it, and usually we use the concept of freedom in a sense of escaping, for instance, from somewhere, trying to understand what that freedom is, freeing ourselves from something, from some kind of conditions. It means that very simply, if we speak about freedom, we always have to somehow understand what we want to, what kind of struggle we want to do, or what kind of struggle we are involved in, and in this struggle to free ourselves. But the main question from this point of view is that whether we can clearly see who it is and what it is we have to struggle against to gain our freedom. It means perhaps we can translate it as an epistemological question, and we are here as scholars and we tell you who is exactly and what is you want to and you have to actually struggle against. But exactly this question whether we have the full picture of this evil we want to exactly and need to fight against is a very important question. And then and directly using this word picture, because this visuality, as we saw in the beginning in your first the presentation, the visuality of this whole representation is crucial, because we have to perhaps see that it's nothing new. In the Middle Ages, visuality was also important, but we see that we are bombarded every day with hundreds and thousands of images, and we are able to read these images. And this is exactly very important to see that we can see and we can show through pictures that freedom is has something to do with escaping from subordination from historically given practices. And if we recognize this in the case of migrants, we probably have to recognize this myth or illusion or utopia also on side of those who are refusing refugees and migrants. It means that they are reproducing in their imagination very similar myths and very similar utopias or very similar desires. And I think that it's a challenge for us. Michel Foucault also reminds us that this struggle for freedom also includes a struggle to free ourselves from ourselves. And again, I think that this is an important, observation which we we can exactly apply in both cases. Similarly, in case of migrants, there are a lot of migrants who want to escape because they don't want to live in that conditions, not just because of the ecological disasters, but also because of religion and economic and hierarchy and all lot of things. It means that they somehow refusing their own identity and their own forms of subordination by accepting other forms of subordination, perhaps. And similarly, we can see how much we are living in the conditions when we are asked to struggle against ourselves, to accept or new ourselves. Perhaps we know the whole discourse about neoliberalism, which is actually about this self-governance to make us ourselves more productive, etc., etc. Similarly, we can see in nationalist and populist movements that actually this topic of struggle to free ourselves from ourselves, because actually part of ourselves is an alien colonizing us, right? What we know from post-colonial discourse. This is part of Eastern Europe or Central Europe too. We could call it in the 90s that was the communists who are inside of us, or the Russians in some sense are inside of us. And nowadays we can call these are the Jews, liberals, Western, etc., etc. You always can define who is exactly somehow inside of us. We have to get rid of it. It means that this is again a topic related with freedom, which is somehow from a scholar's point of view a challenge to deal with. But it's very interesting to see that if you speak with so-called ordinary people, they understand it and they have no trouble with it. I mean, they can deal with these kind of very sophisticated questions. But what is important that actually, if we look at our everyday life, which I think that similarly as we heard, it's very hard to distinguish whether it's a migrant's life or the ordinary natives, who is the native anyway, lives. We see that we live in an everyday life which is permeated by ethical practices, or with ethical practices which we are asked to transform ourselves. Again, it's fashionable to speak about neoliberalism in that sense. It's very important that this kind of discourse or critique of neoliberalism showed, revealed, pointed to these practices. But these practices are here for a long time, and these practices are perhaps very important and present not only in the western side of Europe, but also the eastern side of Europe. We can think about different kind of campaigns against alcoholism, campaigns for different kind of diets, exercises, work habits, etc. Why it's important? It's important because actually in our everyday life we accept somehow that there are discourses about parenting and dating and sleeping and dwelling which exactly reinterpret our recent practices and show us something which is dangerous enough to become an object of intervention. It means that if someone starts to speak about migration and migrants as dangerous, we have to do something with them. It's a normal way of understanding the world. We do it. We have several, 5, 7, 15 thematic objects in our everyday life, almost every day, which is working in the same scheme, right? Showing us something, take care, don't eat this and don't eat that, do this or not with your kids, etc. Because this is dangerous and you have to intervene. It means you have to change yourself. It means that this is something which actually called by, and I will return back to these pictures, by Michel Foucault's aesthetics of existence. Aesthetics of existence is exactly about this taking action in our everyday life, living and seeing is interconnected by showing something which seems to be self-evident. And this is very crucial because if you look at the picturing of migrants, for huge numbers of people, it's self-evident that these guys are dangerous. And we can see exactly the racist logic, etc. behind. But I just want to keep this on this level to show the importance of picturing and the importance of showing that something is self-evidently dangerous. And this appeal that we have to transform ourselves, we have to do something to actually fight and to struggle these dangerous things. You know, this weekend I don't want to go into details from this existentialist, from the post-war existentialist philosophy. We have this kind of concept of gaze with the concept of concrete relations creating intelligibility, right? It means that it's a kind of intelligibility which is not necessarily to explain by words. It means that it shows itself through pictures, through experiences. And so if we return back to the question of freedom, right, then we see that to have freedom, to struggle for freedom, then we have to have a kind of catalogue of dangers, catalogue of evils. And this is how culture also works in our everyday life, also through this kind of rituals and campaigns and all these kind of things. And again, the migrants belong to this catalogues of evil, but they are not only migrants. And exactly if we connect them, right, with drugs, with rapes, with different kind of things, right, it just enforces this kind of self-evident thing that they are dirty, as you know, they are smelling, who is not smelling after 3 weeks, etc., right? But still, right, this kind of health risk. If you have the pictures, we had the pictures with this kind of masks, right? And I mean, perhaps these are concrete practices picturing exactly this catalogue of evil. What is important that actually, and this is what I want to exactly speak about in the second half of my presentation, that in normal situation, these catalogues of evil or catalogues of danger enable us as individuals to practice deductive normative reasoning. It means that we know what is exactly dangerous. Dangers are specified. One is called to change his mode of living by changing his exactly view of world, and exactly when we can name the danger, when we can show the danger, then there is nothing else than actually to apply specific practices, diets and things, and we can solve it. It means that when we see what is happening actually like in Hungary, like in Bulgaria, Serbia, and all this kind of Balkan route stuff, there's a huge performance to demonstrate that actually we are able to identify the danger and we are able to deal with it. The states are working and we are able to take action and we are able to exactly go in a normal way, right? And this is a very important thing to see that exactly, perhaps it's a performative act which legitimizes the state power, but it's also somehow stabilizes this kind of catalogue of evils and stabilizes exactly the situation when we are not turning to question, not just the order. And this is the point when actually we as scholars have to actually not necessarily exercise deductive reasoning, as we heard about this political philosophy, political theory. Nice example how can we try to concretize the idea of cosmopolitanism and different kind of ideas by means of deductive reasoning. But exactly this is exactly a question when we exactly have to turn to questioning in a sense that we are not able to fully see what the danger is. It means that when, and this is actually what I very much liked in the first presentation, but we have to somehow start to use race again, not in the same way, but exactly we do not know how to do it perfectly, and we do not know what it will bring us as a kind of unintended consequence in the discourse also. But we have some kind of contours, but without fully seeing what the danger is, for instance, in using concept, but what the danger is also in the sense of accepting or not accepting hundreds and thousands. And it means that we have to try to conceive what is a danger without being able to clearly describe and name it, right? This is a situation I think we are recently also in academia, because I think that if we will, that this is an illusion, that we have very simple recipes, we just have to accept quotas, for instance, and everything will be solved, right? It means that we just have to be more democratic, or less or more liberals, and everything will be solved. Exactly what is exactly the question is how to understand this ethical intelligibility of the migration, the problem of migration. That for a lot of people it's completely clear what is the danger, completely clear, it's not necessary to persuade them, right? We can call it xenophobia, but I completely agree that it's more than just a kind of prejudice question. It means that being a migrant is seen as a source of danger, which is not just, we can call it hegemonic situation, but it would be important to see that from 2015, we can see that it's culturally established in our everyday life, and not just a culture established, that it's exposed as a kind of normality, as a kind of normal catalogue of events. It means that when we speak about this kind of sensibility, we can see a kind of perfectly intelligible way of seeing what and who is in exactly this kind of central danger. Like here, right? It means that like the alcoholics or the alcoholism. But actually, what is, if we want to understand how does it work, right? So I'm going back to this picture of a freedom fighter from Budapest from the revolution 56, which can say, okay, it's a very clear situation because one is fighting against someone, and what we can see, which is these two applications of the picture, uses of the picture. What I think that demonstrates what is important to see, the context. In the first case, it's a normal poster consumer culture used, right? You can have your intimate place and have a picture to remind you the past, right? Identity, everything. The other is a political usage, right? A political campaign in Hungary, which exactly, it was a kind of scandal that actually they wrote that this guy is, identified the person wrongly. It means that they identify that it's a person named this, and then historians claim that no, this is other person. But it's not the most important stuff. It's important that it can be freely used, and it's exactly used to show that actually the most important is the Hungarian freedom, not freedom, the Hungarian freedom, right? It means that, and perhaps the homeland. Misappropriation can we call, right? What it has to do, it's an anti-communist fighter, or who knows who is that, right? Anyway, it's very important to see that similarly in this case of migration related pictures, right? The migrant as a devil. We always have to see, I don't know, maybe there are homes where there are migrant pictures like that, symbolizing the devil or the opposite, right? But this context of everyday normality, everyday consumer culture, similarly as we can see this kind of political performances are actually important for that. And exactly, also the crucial event in Budapest 2015, as we saw a lot of pictures also from the beginning, in the beginning. Yes. So I think it's not a solution. It's a kind of what we can exactly do with this whole situation from a theoretical point of view. I don't have any kind of practical solution. I think that we can speak about cultural contradictions. Cultural contradictions are actually creating dilemmas which perhaps are not solvable. I think that we are not able to solve them on a theoretical level. Ordinary people are not solving them. They don't care about this contradiction, that there are contradictions. For us, for scholars, it's much more bigger trouble to accept these kind of contradictions. But these are cultural contradictions because they are present at the level of experience of everyday actors, at the level of political discourses, at the level of even legal discourses. It means that there is after 2015, it's very clear that there is a new cultural politics of difference which emerged in eastern part of Europe. Also, we can call it eastern part of Germany belongs to that. It means that articulating a new cultural politic of difference, usually it's called populism, but what is important there is they are reinventing forms of racism and reinventing form of nationalism, and it's very important to see the self-confidence and self-evidence of their discourse and the self-evidence character of understanding, right? It means that they have the other side who very clearly understands what they want and what they speak about. And this shared intelligibility is exactly the crucial what I'm speaking about. We do not need to remind, but it's very important, this is not a divide between migrants and natives. There are a lot of migrants, Poles in Britain, Hungarians in Austria, Serbians, Romanians in Spain, who are part of these discourses, right? This means that they are not the transnationals are the good guys and the natives are bad guys, as we heard. But it's very important, this shared intelligibility is crucial, and exactly these subjectivities which are created by these discourses are characteristically self-confident. I think that it's very, very important to understand how much in this eastern, not only eastern part of Europe, liberals and cosmopolitans, right, let's call them like that, are in defense. They are not able to argue, they're not, perhaps inside of or their small circles. But what is interesting, how this self-confidence and self-evidence is somehow pictured and somehow represented and constituted. And actually, if you look at this side, these pictures, I think that we can find the answer to that. And it's a bit too much cultural theory probably for you, but I don't have a time to speak about very in a detailed manner, but this is an idyllic life picture, right? And my thesis is exactly based on two periods of so-called normalization, which we can, it's very well documented and can research from a historical point of view, the so-called Kadarism, which was a normalization period in Hungary from the 60s and mid-60s, and the Husákism, or how to say, which was a period of normalization in Czechoslovakia in the 70s, the early 80s. And exactly this kind of promise to sustain the idyllic life and promise to sustain the life for life, it means just leave us alone, right? It means that no one will bother you. Like, that's the promise. You can sit in your kitchen and drink, for instance, right? And it's not accidental that the first government of Orban just decriminalized the producing of liquor at home, right? This kind of small signs are important, right? And anyway, this is exactly important because if you look at the other side of the contradiction, this is exactly this universalist rationality which is produced on the level of juridification, in the level of legal norms, and the level of political discourses. But actually we see that in 2015 this was the final break of this categorization and regulation, but not in the sense that it's finished, but it's unconcealed. It's completely clear. And your story was very persuading, and it's very important to see that this works still, this whole machine of creating illegality. But from 2015, it's very clearly almost everyone who is able to or wants to see can see what we see that they don't see. Right? It's important to see that the category of refugee is overlapping with the category of unskilled migration. And they are exactly, somehow this machine creates slaves in some sense. It's a kind of enslavement. I don't want to speak about this, rather go to this other, form, how much actually this everyday representation of migrants, right, touches our ethical sensibility, not just as a danger that they are not deservable, right, not deserving the refugee status, right, and these pictures are, you will see that it's by intentions white males, right, because this is the opposite, this is the scandal. White guy cannot be exactly ill, have to work, right, and etc., etc. But this ethical sensibility is important because this is encoded in this idyllic picture of nice everyday life, right, which not just promise, but in some sense try to fulfill in the 60s, 70s, right, when you can forget who you were, in what kind of fights you were, and you just live your life in as a kind of survival. It means that these collective projects we call populist actually manifest worries about the human being's spheres of intimacy. When they speak about rape, right, and associated things, we have to take it seriously. But these are some kind of manifestation of the fears and worries about their own intimacy. Intimacy, not necessarily bodily intimacy, but their sphere or places of intimacy, this kind of sphere of change, not just a change, not the sphere, not necessarily a sphere of violence, right? It's somehow articulated by means of fear of violence. What is important that actually the other side, the cosmopolitan liberal human rights regime is a part, and we should not forget also from this point of view, it's a part of a global topography of capital, media and technology, which actually is able to understand, able to accept only one kind of difference between the rich and the poor, right? And not recognizes any other kind of difference which in some sense creates any kind of differences anachronistic. Right? Religious differences, ethnical differences, national differences are just seen from this point of view as anachronistic. And perhaps it means that this is exactly the same drive, change yourself. You cannot speak in this language, you have to learn the other language. You have to, it is a kind of refusal of ordinary guys as they are. And what these governments are doing and offering, similarly in the communist times as now, they are accepting people as they are, right? At this first level, you don't want to change them in that sense. Perhaps we know that it's a kind of promise that it means that instead of difference between the rich and the poor, they speak about other differences, which are treated and understood by people as really important. this anachronism created a very interesting conflict in the 90s when the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages was created. It was actually a first and very important manifestation of this kind of divide between the West and the East. Because until that, the European Council, it's not EU, right? It's broader, the Council of Europe. It was based on human rights charter. It was a clearly nice, legal-based juridification discourse, just human rights, no anything else, just individuals. And in the 90s, the Easterners started to speak about their own languages, about regional languages, minority languages. Perhaps that different other regions from the West started to speak about their regional languages also. But what is crucial, that it was self-evident, or it was created self-evidently, that there is one category of languages which could not be included into this charter, and it was the migrants' languages. Right? And it was a very simple and very important point of codification of who is native in Europe, and this is linked to heritage. Right? It means that we can call it Muslims, we can call it blacks, Arabs, etc. But this kind of symbolic exclusion was very importantly related, this kind of mythical and racist grounds of European identity. It means that actually I think that European self-understanding, as you mentioned, it's clearly racist. It's a kind of mythical racist universalism conceals this kind of mythical racism heritage discourse. I'm finishing these two kind of challenges with this whole picture brings us epistemological and ethical challenge, and I finish, right? Epistemologically, yes, I really like the critique of methodological nationalism and also this kind of idea of going beyond ethnic lens. But somehow it's very important to see that from the analytical position, analytical point of view, it works as a part of explanatory scheme, but does not work as a, sorry to distinguish so sharply this understanding and explanation. I know that we have to combine it, but from understanding's point of view, we have to take into consideration that these kind of myths, these kind of mythic pictures have a very important symbolic and efficiency, right? Symbolic power. And we can see that also from the point of view of dignity, from the point of view of individual freedom of migrants and subalterns, sometimes ethnicity, similarly as religion, and I just remembered during your speech Malcolm X, right, how the subalterns can turn to the religion as a kind of form of finding dignity. We know that it's a failed project, probably, as a kind of collective project. But this is exactly what is important, that ethnic lens, if not analytically, then from a practical discourse point of view, can be a very important part of collective projects. And this epistemological how to say, challenge is that also probably in migration studies we have to give up this kind of idea of historically constituted emancipatory subject. Like the working class was before, right, in social theory and sociology, that they will actually emancipate us, liberate us, because they are living in such a conditions. And now we tend to look at migrants as a historically constituted emancipatory class who will liberate us, because they will come and liberate us. And I think that it's hard to sustain, right, from an epistemological point of view. But we can think about collective projects, not necessarily about collectivities, right? And I think that the whole methodological nationalists and the critique of methodological nationalism and the ethnic lens idea is very important, because similarly as this race idea, that it shows that collective projects can be constituted around this kind of ideas and myths and also utopias to escape from, right, several from these conditions. Ethical challenge, that's the verse. So I try to just move through it. I think that exactly what normalization shows us about these societies is exactly a very simple distinction between what death means for us and for the others. This is actually nothing new, it's a kind of ethnocentrism, but somehow we have to, again, probably accept how deeply we are ethnocentric in Europe, and probably not just in Europe, it means that these lives does not matter. And for a lot of people, it's not, how to say, it's not very much complicated, and it's very easy to say that does not matter, right? It means that if you look at, but perhaps I don't want to generalize that for everyone, because it's very important to see different kind of ethnic, different kind of activism also in Hungary in those days, in 50s, right? But this kind of self-confidence and self-evidence of this new politics of identity is actually based also in the self-evidence that all deaths matter, and we will pay milliards to health system, and we will save everyone, but those can die, right? And this is very important because this is exactly related to this idyllic vision of everyday life, when we actually work, but actually have this kind of normal way of life for life, and we want nothing else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Now it's the floor for... Okay, so inspirited for your questions, I hope. Last slide. So please, there's a floor for questions. Yeah.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it inspires me to raise two things. One is that I've been struck over the last several years by the ways in which a variety of populist movements in Europe articulate themselves not only as nationalist movements, but repeatedly we see the expression of a kind of identitarian Europeanism. So, you know, maybe the most one of the most striking examples is Pegida in Germany, who named themselves patriotic Europeans, even though, you know, much of what they represent is a very kind of predictable kind of German nationalism and Nazism and so on. They embrace and uphold and promote what they call patriotic Europeanism. You know, and there are several examples that I could give, but one of the striking things is that there is at stake in these struggles a kind of articulation of an identitarian Europeanism that I was suggesting is part of a racial formation of post-colonial whiteness. But it raises this interesting question about the ways in which these particular convulsions of reactionary populism are not only, or not reducible to a nationalist sensibility. Related to that, you know, one of the things that I am also interested in is to understand how the critique of methodological nationalism needs also to be, in this context, a critique of methodological Europeanism. And also to distinguish how, alongside a methodological Europeanism, we also have a methodological EU Europeanism, right? Whereby Europe gets conflated and equated and collapsed into the EU. So I just wanted to raise those as kinds of comments to which you might respond. Then the second one is just that one of the things that strikes me about your focus on the idyllic and this kind of desire to be left alone, in a sense, is that it seems symptomatic to me of a collapse of any politics of the future. Right? So these reactionary movements are able to capitalize on a desire to go back to something, even if it's a complete fabrication, even if it's a complete imagined past, this idyllic past. Somehow there was once upon a time a way that we could be ourselves and we were happy and comfortable and not threatened and so on. But it's backward looking. It doesn't articulate a politics of the future. And in part, this is symptomatic, I think, of you know, the weight of neoliberal capitalism on, you know, and the consequences of dispossession and disenfranchisement and so on that make people unable to imagine a different future. And so they want only to extend the present a little bit longer because they can only imagine a bad future. It's only possible to imagine it getting worse, right? So more of the present, or at best, in these kinds of reactionary populist convulsions, kind of imagined past that could be recuperated somehow. But that raises a different question, which is the incapacity of people on the left to articulate a vision of the future in a way that, you know, I think is deeply symptomatic of the post-Cold War moment, the extended post-Cold War moment.
Thank you very much for the questions. I will start with the last. It's very important. Can I just?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I think that this apocalyptic mood is important in that, because this kind of apocalyptic mood that what will come will be just a catastrophe, nothing good, is perhaps also in Eastern Europe related to this kind of very enthusiasm in the beginning of 2000s, entering the European Union, and it was a kind of achievement, or the political discourse also focused on that, and the Euroscepticism is actually using this kind of that, okay, but what is exactly the achievement? How is what we achieved, and what's the next point? And there is nothing next to. And it's very interesting because actually if we look at the 70s and the 60s, this is exactly the normalization is about offering this instant present. Right? This is exactly a kind of forgetting the past in some sense, not necessarily idyllic, because this kind of communist rhetoric stress the distinction between the bad past of the war and the pre-war periods, exploitations, forms, etc., and the recent actually emancipated life, which was actually in a kind of instant present. It's what is interesting that we have a lot of interviews, post-Holocaust Jewish Budapest persons speaking about exactly the nice way they live in the 70s, because there is nothing to worry, they can live a normal life, and there is no vision of the future, even their own death, right? Okay, it's authenticity and no one sees his own death, but still, there is no future, right? But there is something which can be achieved. And in that case, right, in this kind of post-Holocaust identities, we can explain, okay, that's because of the trauma, that's because it was something bad happening, and they survived at least, and they want to forget it. And they were offered a kind of new identity when you are apolitical and you can sit in your kitchen, right? But this is very important, as you mentioned, that this politics of future is missing in some way, right? And this instant present exactly somehow conceals this collapse of the promise of some kind of real change which is not apocalyptic. It is related to Europeanism. I think that actually lot of European identity discussions are there minimally from the 60s, 70s, etc., where we can see similarly as in case of migrants, also in case of Europeans, we don't need to idealize this collective subject, and we can see that there are several kinds of myths and identity resources which can be used for our European identity, and this heritage is so wild and from the Roman Empire up to anti-fascist resistance, right? That actually almost all kind of all European can pick up and create its own heritage, and we see that until the 90s, it was much more a kind of identity which started or tried to create an identity based on this kind of juridical, legal framework without any clear relationship to this historical heritage. But from the 90s, it's almost impossible, right? And mainly because of the Easterners, in some sense, mainly because of the religious question. And there are very interesting books also which actually decode the human rights regime as a kind of very much systematic form of juridification and suppression of memory-based local identities. So it's again a question of kind of struggle for freedom in the name of European identity, but we have to identify what kind of adversaries are there in this discourse.
I was asked to wrap up, but I hope we can still have those two questions because I saw those two hands raised. So please, there are two questions. Try to be very
I will try to be quick. Thank you very much for this kind of a very provocative tour. But on my question is, I mean, one part is about that Europe part about this, because when we look at these kind of mobilizations and what you call the kind of the intimacies in a way that are mobilized together, I mean, not necessarily everything is about ethnic, but also anti-Europe. So Hungary, I mean, and you see this very, very strongly. But so I'm a bit uneasy about, I see that point, as of course it is the ethnicity might be the moving, the triggering, that's something that captures. But when you, but it is not natural. It is not natural, and you can only talk about that within the histories of Europe, within this whole racialized, actually, and orientalized histories of Europe, which is very much there. My problem is that when you talk about the cultural contradictions and when you talk about the what you call ethical intelligibility of the phenomenon of migration, as if the cultural contradictions are very, I mean, by existence they are there. And we know so many cases where these are not there, that those kind of contradictions are not there. They are the products of particular processes, and of course we're talking of the age of that, after that kind of imagined communities, age of imagined communities, where the ethnic was very easily triggered and combined together with culture. The reason why I'm asking is that how, and I think as social scientists, no matter how I understand the kind of the aesthetics and how it gets into the intimacy, creates kind of intimacy, that we should, maybe we should be understanding how come certain categories and certain chains of equivalences, I would say, are created so that it becomes like that the Muslim and then racialized and that they're put together and acquire that kind of effect. The reason, I will just stop, because the reason I am asking for that is that I had worked on racist discourses and movements in Turkey in the 70s. And it is pure racist. That was I worked on the pure racist ones. And they were ethnic based and race based. And all the animosities, all the conflicts, that they did not kill anyone whose eyes and the physical shape was not fitting. They only killed leftists. So, and it was, so I'm very, I mean, there is a kind of, and I sense a hint that ethnic affiliations are in a way natural and it could move us. But I would like to see how and what they're moved in. And the other question was about the visuality, the importance of visuality, I think. Without that, the refugee code crisis could not have acquired that kind of presence, I think, without the visuality.
Could we collect the last sentence? Yeah, please. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation again, very thought-provoking as everyone has mentioned so far. So 2 points very quickly. First one that I was interested in, which actually ties both Maria and your talk, I think you could summarize it in terms of categories. You mentioned basically that nowadays we're diffusing differences, so essentially we're suffering from some kind of reductionism where we acknowledge, you say, the extremes, which is, okay, poverty and richness, but we're diffusing everything else that makes us different human beings. So this is essentially, in our philosophy students, so I like to tackle this point of block categories that were, I guess, these categories are obviously not usable for us anymore. And the whole question is of practicality, because we can't just talk and do nothing, of course. So I guess that in other fields, in science, for example, I understand that they're doing work in understanding categories as more of a synthesis, and they're dynamic. So I wonder how it is in your field. I'm not that well acquainted in how we can maybe use this thought process that it's used in science to understand, in a way, to incorporate these differences. Do you think such categories are even possible to make in the field of politics in order to essentially put them in use to make a more productive policies and so on that could benefit us for this? And second question, very quickly, sorry. I am, 4 questions. Working myself as a young curator in interdisciplinary projects, actually studying, where actually it's a revolt of against this passivity that you describe of the layperson nowadays. And we're working to, because we think that we can acknowledge from our interdisciplinary backgrounds and also our different ethnicities, to bring back, as Nietzsche was hoping, especially in his Zarathustra book, to fight for critical thinking, because I think essentially we can single out this is the big problem. There's too much passivity, we're not taking power. Essentially the government seems to be taking the power for the layperson to think for themselves. We're told what to think, but we're not asked to think for ourselves, because this poses a problem, I guess. So if you could.
Thank you very much for all these questions. I try to combine them and answer quickly by an example. Or there is some, no, nothing. Categories, critical thinking, pictures, ethnicity. I have a cousin in Budapest who was until 2015 almost a fascist, right-wing, Jobbik activist, and you do not choose your cousins. Anyway, but it happened in those days when Keleti was full of refugees that he went to see, like the zoo, right? I mean, let's see them. And he was moved and went to buy pizza and brought them pizza, and then went home and wrote a big Facebook post that these are kids, real kids. And me as a father could not do anything, just go to buy pizza for them, right? And he posted it. You can imagine the reactions, crazy, blah, blah, right? Everything. And this is very important, because until that he was really posting all regularly pictures which were very racist, very simple, and different kind of slogans and everything. And perhaps this is a kind of example, exceptional, etc. But we have several other examples of this experience, direct, immediate experience with the persons, which can change something, right? He's still voting Jobbik.
Jobbik became better than Orban.
But it means that there is some kind of change. But it was interesting that it was not generating a critical thinking. He was not recategorizing the persons. And he's still kind of macho guy, but he became anti-government, right? And this is exactly a very interesting, almost ethnographically, I think it explains something, that he was moved by the migrants because they were kids suffering. It means that because of his father's identity, right? And he had to do something, concretely, he had to do something. And somehow had to create a coherence between his self before, his racist, Jobbik self, who was supporting that, and this change. And he changed because he turned to be anti-government, anti-Orban, right? Which is, I mean, logically, you know, you cannot exactly understand why this or why that, but it means, very simply, I think that these kind of pictures and even more experiences can generate change. But they are not generating necessarily change in a way we, as scholars, will expect to critical thinkers will behave, right, in the sense. And just ethnicity, last thing to the ethnicity, I think that for the Central European experience of ethnicity, the cultural assimilation is crucial. It means that ethnicity is very much connected to forgetting. And what I mean again by the example, everyone knows, it's already, we learn it in the basic school, that the biggest Hungarian poet, Sándor Petőfi, had a Serbian father and Slovak mother. But he is still treated as ethnically Hungarian, right? And this is a contradiction you can live with, I mean, in a sense, right? Be a proud nationalist and know that there is kind of, and it's not a trouble, right, to deal with. Everyone knows, but somehow ethnicity means, in that sense, that you play the game of naturalness, right? It means that you somehow forget. And this is an important, similarly as we can see in post-Holocaust Jewish identities, not just in Hungary, that the communists gave a chance to forget, to create a new identity, to forget that had anything to do with some kind of heritage and parents and the grandparents and all that stuff. And still they can become Hungarians without any past, right? And this is a kind of symbolic ethnicity, if we can claim it in that sense, but presenting itself as something natural.
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to finish. Thank you very much.